Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Pete Simpson, Chief Exec of Anglian Water. We're, along with Bob, one of the people who've sort of been trying to raise the profile of what we've been doing on leakage as an industry. And I think a commitment both Bob and I made a few years ago now was that we would endeavour to get the profile up around leakage. And it's really, really encouraging to see that profile changing and the momentum really growing. And I'm told, actually, that this event was booked up many, many weeks ago, and just seeing the room packed out is really, really encouraging. But I'm also told you're an unruly bunch by Judith, so we're already 3 minutes late, and as it falls to me to chair the first half of this session, I'm going to put that all with you. Actually, you turned up late, but never mind. This is the 22nd Annual Leakage Conference. It is genuinely fantastic to see so many of you here, and it's great to meet in person, isn't it? I'm sure you enjoyed last night. There's something about being together in the room. But one of the advantages of having come through a pandemic is the technology, and I'm delighted to say we've been able to embrace that, and we've actually got colleagues joining us remotely via Zoom. So you are also incredibly welcome, and they'll be taking an active part in the Q&A as we go through. So I think, as we all know, as we head towards PR24, it's a really important moment for us all to be together. The challenges are really huge, ambitious challenges in terms of the impact of climate change, increasingly ambitious challenges in terms of the environment as well, and sometimes it gets lost, you know, the role that leakage plays in reducing the amount of water we take out of the environment and the benefits that we can bring. And that's something I think that we need to kind of up the profile on as we go through. But anyway, before we start the main programme, I'd just like to give a really warm welcome to our exhibit supporters, without whom this event wouldn't be possible. So BERMAD, Electroscan, Enginsoft with MWH Treatment, George Fisher, Gutterman, HWM, Muller, Ovaro, Cyrenix, Technolog, and of course the Water Report. It also falls to me to highlight a few practical things. First of all, phones. Please turn off your phones and any other device with notifications. I don't know if you, like me, you have all these apps and you suddenly realise you've got 20 things that will tell you something really, really important, but please not during these sessions. In terms of health and safety, there are no planned fire alarm tests, so if there is an alarm, you'll need to leave by the exits, and they're marked very clearly, and there'll be fire marshals who will take us to the point of assembly. In terms of Q&As, please do raise questions. It just brings these sort of things to life if you're interacting with the speakers. You'll have had all the information around Slido, so hopefully you know how to use that. I'm going to be walking around, and Bob will be walking around with an iPad later on and pulling those questions out to make sure that we get that interaction. We're also going to be taking polls throughout the day, so do pay attention to those, and we'll be coming into the breaks, and after the breaks we'll be coming and telling you what the results of some of those polls are. So we'll be tracking how the sentiment is changing around some questions as we go through the day. So hopefully that will be useful. There's also a thought wall. It's got nothing on it so far, which is not great, but I'm sure it will be heavily populated at the end of the session. You might remember, was it 3 years ago when we sort of had everybody together, we started doing that idea of putting a thought wall up, and we used that to actually inform some of the roadmap that Bob's going to talk to in a minute. So it actually went somewhere. It wasn't one of these posted exercises that sort of sat in glorious isolation. We actually used that content. So on your tables, you've got traditional stickies, post-it notes. You get 3 each for your top 3 priorities. You don't have to use all 3, but please don't use more than 3, otherwise it ruins the democracy of all of this. But please do go and put your ideas on the thought wall. And the ideas we're looking for is, you know, what do you think are the critical success factors, the key projects, the key products, the things that you think will make the biggest difference as on our journey towards reducing leakage. So, thought wall. Also, Judith will kill me very slowly if I don't mention these feedback forms. As you know from these events, this is intelligence about the things that you like, the things you don't like, the steers you want to give us in terms of running these events. So this is again is stuff that's used. It doesn't just sit on the shelf. It does actually get used as we sort of put these conferences together. So please do fill in the feedback forms at the end of the day. So we need to move on to the first session, and I'd like to welcome Bob Taylor, my fellow sponsor of the Leakage Commitment. I'm sure we all know Bob. I have to say he's been an incredibly passionate advocate of this whole agenda There isn't a single meeting that we've had at Water UK that I can remember in the last few years where Bob hasn't said something about leakage, usually interrupting somebody else, but that's really good because it's kept it right at the top of the priorities. And we've made fantastic strides over the past few years. And Bob's going to talk about delivering that quantum leap in industry performance, the leakage public interest commitment, and the launch, critically, of the Water UK Routemap. So over to you, Bob.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're all still smiling at this important moment after a bit of a late night last night for many of you, I think, from what I've been told. But that's one of the beauties of this conference, that everybody gets the opportunity to get to know each other a bit better and exchange ideas and experiences over a glass of something in the bar. So I think that theme of community and that theme of learning from one another and that theme of gaining experience from others is still as strong as it ever is in terms of what we need to achieve in the future with the leakage roadmap. I'm not sure how we're changing slides. Here we go. There's a little thing. So there are a few people here, judging by the little speech I made last night, who can cast their minds back to the early 1980s. There have been a number of, for me, milestone moments. I've been involved in leakage almost since I started in the water industry, which is nearly 40 years ago now. And in those days, there was a really important sort of landmark piece of work done by WRC, which is, we all know as Report 26. And that was in the early 1980s, and that was when we started using leak noise correlators for the first time and electronic data loggers and so on, and had a major impact on the way that we manage leakage. And that was brought about by, again, concerns from government, particularly that leakage levels were generally on the rise in the industry, and we needed to do something. And that's how the industry responded at that time, not dissimilar to what we're trying to do now in terms of coming up with some new ideas. District metering came in at that time, for example. Pressure management started to be used on a more wide-scale basis, and that stood us in good stead for the challenges of privatisation in the late 1980s, 1989, and the years beyond that. And another milestone event that some may remember in the mid-1990s was the Leakage Summit. Does anybody remember that? I can see a few heads were nodding, and that was when John Prescott called all of the water company bosses in. I wasn't a water company boss in those days. I was a young engineer making my way in the water industry. But he waved a hippo bag around and said, save on leakage, reduce your leakage. And that's where where mandatory targets originated for the industry. And then fast forward a few years from that, and the whole sort of update on Report 26 came into being, the Managing Leakage suite of reports. And all of this stuff that we've developed here in the UK, starting with Report 26, is all taken on board globally, internationally. Everybody has taken on board our thinking and our ways of working, or pretty much everybody around the world in leakage management. So what we're talking about today in terms of the Routemap is the next chapter in that book, I suppose. Another important landmark event where we've really taken stock of the achievements that we've made over the last 30 or 40 years and put them in the context of what we need to achieve moving forward from here, which is a significantly greater challenge and is going to mean even more intense working as an industry, as water companies, as supply chain, as academia, than we've done in the past. And you can see, you can read that slide. I'm not going to pick out some of the features of it, but you can see certain events over the years, like severe winters and so on. The economic level of leakage concept evolution, which is almost disappearing now as a concept, and moving more, as Peter said a moment ago, into environmental concerns more than anything, and securing the general future of water supplies in the UK. That graph, if you're looking at that graph there, let me just flick back again. Oops, no, sorry. You know, that does sort of have a trajectory where things are sort of moving down quite steeply initially, and it gives the impression that things have flattened off and there hasn't been much activity. But of course, behind that, if you look at this presentation here, you will see that lots of work has been done in the last 15 years because within that period, our networks have been growing, our populations have been growing, and we all know that in order to stand still in leakage terms, there's a huge amount of effort needed in that alone. And the graph, the flattening graph, sort of hides in some ways all of the activity that's had to go on in the background, and that's illustrated by the movement of all of these companies from sort of top right-hand corner down towards bottom left-hand corner. Some of them significant. The big green one there is Scottish Water, I think. Huge inroads made in that period post the reorganisation of the Scottish industry and the creation of Scottish Water about 17, 18 years ago. So another important point that we need to get across, and we're starting to get across through the CMA process, for example, recently, is that the lower leakage goes, the more energy and effort needs to be put in and more cost to keep it at that level. And I think that is something that we've not really kind of explained well outside of these circles to others who are part of the overall perspective here, including particularly regulators. So on to the targets that we have set ourselves for the future, and there are a couple of those targets. The PIC target, as you know, is to triple the rate of leakage reduction by 2030, and then you've got the 2050 target, for which the National Infrastructure Commission proposed, which is to reduce leakage by 50% using 2018, 2020 levels as a base. And of course, the base that we are talking about here is the lowest ever leakage that we have achieved in this country. So the starting point it's a challenging starting point in itself. But when you just start to look at some of these numbers here, you will see that they're quite considerable. They're quite frightening in some ways, quite challenging undoubtedly. But we need to deliver a reduction in simple terms of about 1,300 megalitres in 30 years. That's what it boils down to. And that's broadly 500 in this next 5 years, AMP7, 500 in the next 5, and another 300 in the 10 years following that. And relative to what has gone before and the savings that have been made previously, as the labels on the graph say, these are very large numbers. So it is a challenge, and I think we have to meet that level of activity, a new level of innovation, a new level of collaboration in order to meet those challenges. The Routemap really is not coming up with all of the answers necessarily. There are still a lot of unknowns, still a lot of areas that we need to investigate. But there are other areas that where more can be done. So for me, there are areas of poor understanding. Background leakage is one of those. Background leakage is sometimes calculated as about 50% of leakage levels today, and our understanding of background levels of leakage is still quite poor. So that's an area where activity needs to increase. But there are areas of possibility here as well. Supply pipe leakage is probably the biggest one for me. With all of the tech that we have these days, all of the smart tech and smart metering and so on, this is evolving almost on a constant basis. I think we need to get better at understanding supply pipe leakage better and tackling it better. And of course, the whole debate about supply pipe ownership is part of that discussion. But there are also areas of optimism as well, including the fact that within this era or this area of the water industry, we have a track record of collaboration, a track record of innovation, and there are new tools available to us. For example, Spring, the collaboration platform that we've developed in the sector to encourage innovation, encourage and bring companies and supply chain organisations together to collaborate. There's lots of reason to be optimistic because of what's gone in the past, and those are the areas I've listed there that we need to continue to work hard. So, you know, the fact that we're all sitting here together, and this is a regular thing now, there's another conference being planned later this year already. It's a sellout conference, as Peter has said. It's really important that we take advantage of the fact that we're here together to support in these areas of learning and collaboration and come up with proposals, ideas to keep moving things forward in the right direction, because the challenges are considerable, but there is a way to achieve them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bob. So the history, the route map, the challenge, the public interest commitment, the National Infrastructure Commission, 1,300 megalitres in 30 years. That focuses your mind, doesn't it? And the route map, there are still gaps, but there's plenty of opportunities. And as Bob says, we can be optimistic in terms of the level of innovation and collaboration that's going on. So we're now going to move into sort of, I suppose, deeper dive around the route map and go into a bit more detail and really get this informed by lots of perspectives from water companies and their insights and perspectives on this. So I'd love to welcome Frank van der Kai. Have I got that right? Klei? I'll have a go. Onto the stage. Frank's, as we all know, is a principal consultant at Stantec, but many more of us will know from his days at Bristol Water. Frank, please let me get the pronunciation of your name right.
Van der Klei.
Van der Klei. I'll get it right. Okay, super. So you're very, very welcome. And Frank's going to run this next session for us. So over to you, Frank.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's really good to see you all in person. I'm getting a bit tired of Zoom and Teams, but thank you, Bob and Peter, for a really, really thorough introduction. And the next two sessions are all about the route map, as Peter said. So we're running two sessions here, and the first session will be very much around the detail. So we've got Dean, Joe, and Glenn, who have been leading the work with their teams on the route map, and they've been working closely with Water UK for quite some time now. It's been taking over, I think, part of their lives over the last 6 to 9 months. And if anything, this will be that watershed moment that Bob has talked about. It's the route map towards bigger things that need to happen in the industry to meet those nick and pick kind of level of performance. You can raise your questions. Please use Slido. All the details were on the board earlier on. Log into it, please. 22 Leakage. Get your questions there. And nobody has posted questions yet, but please do so. So without further ado, we've got a lot to cover in the next 2 hours. I would like to invite Dean, Joe, and Glenn as well, to start their sequential presentations on the detail of the route map.
Morning, everybody. Echo Frank's view there about nice to see everybody in person. Great to see a lot of faces again, and have you in the room. So we're going to talk through the development of the leakage route map. So we're starting here with me. I'm Glenn Mountfort, Director of Technical Consulting at WRC. So I've got this first bit before I then hand to Dean and Joe to do the next bit. So we've worked very collaboratively on this between ourselves and with the whole industry. So the first session here, I'm just going to talk a bit about the challenges that the industry is facing. In terms of the pick and the nick targets there, we've got some significant challenges around these. So a number of these have been touched on already, but I think first and foremost, the leakage in the wider context of water resources is something that's very, very important. For a long time, we went with leakage being sort of an input into the WRMP process rather than an integral part of it. At PR19, WRMP19, that started to really change, and all companies then started to fully integrate leakage options in that planning process, which is very, very important. The longer term challenges are sort of numerous, but population growth being a key one, sustainability reductions, protecting the environment, and the impact of climate change are all playing a significant role. So leakage is vitally important, and there are some significant future challenges in that space. So better understanding of the fundamentals. How much leakage is background? We've touched on them. Why is that important? Well, it's always been important in the context of the economics of managing leakage. It's the single most important factor, really, in terms of your SELL. Adjust your background leakage by 1 meg, and it'd have that impact on your ELL or cell. Why is it still important? I think it's actually even more important than it's ever been, because that challenge to reduce by 50% by 2050 is so significant. The ability to achieve that will really depend on that level of background leakage, and certainly the route you will take might be very, very different. It'd be quite easy to sort of head on the wrong path if that wasn't understood. So what we really need to do as an industry here is get to grips with what is going on there. Is it on plumbing losses? Is it on supply pipes? Is it weeps and seeps from the network? And how do the different policies as well affect it? So it's not just a quantification piece here. It's very much about how smart metering, smart networks, all sorts of other activities can influence that level. How achievable can it be? And that could really have some bearing on the longer term strategies for companies. Customer side, we've also sort of touched on, completely agree with Bob, this is absolutely vital. This is the known unknown in the room. And we've got so much to learn really about customer side leakage. The assets are not well understood. There aren't generally very good records of them. Even less known probably about the deterioration of the assets. So that poses a huge, huge risk over the 25 years. If the industry doesn't take a sort of a stance to really tackle that problem, it could be the undoing of the 2050 goal if we're not careful as an industry. So I think we can't stress the importance in terms of that. It really needs the industry to sort of grab hold of. It came close to adopting back in, I think, 2013. That debate really does need to come around again. So how much of the target can be achieved through active leakage control? Yeah, that's been one of the mainstays of managing leakage up to this point. How much into the future, how much more of that is achievable, or is it more leading towards assets and smarter technology? So various challenges around that. Regional differences we know are absolutely vital to take account of. So many different reasons leakage performance varies across the UK. There's differences in costs, there's differences in topography, there's underlying network differences, there's different water resources drivers, so that's important. And how does asset health and other external drivers impact on leakage? So as a sector, we've been very sort of focused on serviceability, targeting burst mains, etc. But what about the leakage element there, particularly background leakage? And also, how do performance commitments like the supply interruptions measures affect leakage? Well, there's one key bit is that is not particularly helpful at the moment in terms of effectively killing off the market in terms of realigning at the moment. So I know that's something that throughout this process, I think everybody has been sort of shouting about, and we've been talking to regulators about as well. The 3-hour window there, which is about the same time as it takes to cure with some of the realigning technology. So there's things like that as well we've been exploring through this process. Leakage in the bigger picture of WRMPs. So the National Framework for Water Resources, that set out the challenge for water resources as a whole. So there we've got 3,435 megalitres a day needed for public supply to address the pressures by 2050. As it stands, regional plans are factoring in at least a 50% reduction in leakage, and it's a significant focus here. So I'm not going to go through the stats on there word for word, but one of the key things, 50% of the national needs in the southeast, and we've got huge volumes required in terms of sustainability changes there, so over 2,000 MLD, as well as the demand from households increasing significantly. That's partly through population, well, really through population growth over time. The move to 1 in 500 resilience, and then climate change. So it really does all stack up, and there's a significant need to do more. So a lot of these challenges are quite interlinked. So we've touched on their background leakage and customer side leakage. So there's more needed across these areas. And this was I think one of the key points is leakage management activities. What do you do? What do you do to achieve this 2050 target? It's very hard. Dean will come on to in a few minutes when we're starting to look at the modelling. The level of background leakage could really have a significant influence on the right path for an individual company. We've set out the challenges there around customer side leakage, and it all sort of interlinks. What element of background leakage is actually customer side, etc. So some of these fundamental questions we need to do more to answer. And it's not that as a sector we haven't been answering them. It's just we now need to get into an extra layer of detail, because it's so important in terms of coming up with the right strategy. So I think sometimes we just need to be careful in how we sort of say these things, because it sometimes sounds like we're saying we haven't got a clue on what background leakage is. It's not the case. We know what it is in terms of our current policy, but the questions we need to ask are the emerging policies in AMP7. There's a lot of new technology, new approaches. What do they mean in terms of background leakage? So that's where the learning needs to come in, the information sharing, etc., between the industry. And then finally from me, just touching on asset health and some of the other impacts. So practically, how far can you go with find and fix? You've got the steepening active leakage control cost curve. Whatever way you sort of look at it, it's going to get progressively more expensive, more difficult, more challenging. How low can we go? I think upper quartile companies will struggle perhaps to achieve the 50% reduction without making a step change in terms of asset health. And leakage isn't just the only driver here as well. So there's low pressure, there's water quality, there's customer service and minutes lost, all of those other things to consider when looking at asset health. The unintended consequences, improvements in relining. We're not really as a sector perhaps as active as we might be in that area with some of the latest developments, and that's that bit of tension between some of the performance commitments. So I think it's important that we as an industry have that dialogue with the regulators about different performance commitments, and if there are barriers and things like that emerging. It's not necessarily by design, but these things happen, so we need to try and avoid those, because we can go a whole 5 years then where it can really sort of slow things up. So they're important things to be thinking about when we go through PR24. The best value approach is important here. So the role of advanced analytics in targeting better understanding your assets and targeting where to renew and get best value, where to rehabilitate. Better condition assessment is possibly something that needs to happen as well. I think that's perhaps one area that as a sector we're probably doing less of. Back in the sort of 90s, 2000s, there was more asset renewal going on. That level's dropped now to probably what most people consider is an unsustainable level. So this is a real challenge to be addressed. And what understanding needs to be gained there? I think there's certainly some opportunity in terms of better understanding condition. We've got an example there where you've got, based on burst history, a piece of pipe that's showing it's at high risk, but actually there's only relatively small bits of it once you've gone in and done some condition assessment that you might need to deal with. So it's that intelligence. It's going to be quite important in making sure you're getting best value. Supply pipe asset deterioration, the big known unknown, really critical. And then targeting leakage and not just sort of bursts. I think that'll be a sort of a bit of a shift in approach. I think as a sector we're very good at the burst targeting, but how on earth do you actually target something like background leakage? So I think the condition assessment might be key to being able to do that. So that's it from me in terms of the challenges. So now I'm just going to hand to Dean to talk about how we created the Routemap.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dean Marshall-Say from Artesia Consulting, and I think as Frank alluded to, we've spent a good deal of the last 12 months, the three of us, working on this and trying to come up with this Routemap and framework which we're talking about today. And it's really nice to be here in person. I think one of the themes that comes out through this Routemap is about collaboration and sharing. And I think if the discussions in the bar and at dinner last night and over breakfast this morning are anything to go by, then I think we're off to a good start. I'm going to run through a few slides just to tell you what we did in the process. It's going to be very quick canter through. And I'm going to start with this slide. It's very busy, and I don't expect you to look at the detail, but you know, we have been quite busy in the whole of this process. We started by looking back over the history of where we've come from when we really started to quantify leakage properly in the early 90s. And Bob took us through very eloquently that process of how we got through to all companies in 2020 meeting their leakage targets. But we also looked around the world and outside of the UK, and you know, a lot of, as Bob's mentioned earlier, a lot of the theories, the practices, the processes we developed in the 80s and 90s were taken around the world, and they have taken them and used them in different ways and enhanced them and applied them to different areas. And we thought that's very important to get that information. And we talked to a whole range of people and did a lot of background research into that. And I think one of the things that came out of that, there's no silver bullet, you know. There isn't one thing that will resolve that. And a lot of the feedback we got from talking to these people was that it's about understanding the local conditions. What are the constraints locally? Where are you? What are the things that are presenting your challenges? Why do you need to drive leakage down? And then finding the best solutions to that. So part of that was to try and also look at what are the blockers to the progress. Why are we where we are? Why did leakage level off? And it has been level for quite some time. Although in recent, you know, at the end of AMP6, there were a number of companies that drove leakage down. We also ran a number of workshops with the leakage managers, other leakage practitioners, the supply chain, and we had a whole series of workshops. And in that middle bit we made extensive use of Miro boards to do that because it was all done remotely rather than round a table in a big room, and that was really useful. We found so much out about that. Each company is different. They've all got different starting conditions, starting points. There are many tools in the toolbox. There's a lot of innovation that's been identified. There's a lot of innovation that's going on, and I think when we came out of that process, we had, I don't know, upwards of 80 sort of different variations on interventions and tools that could be used now and in the future. And we took that opportunity then to talk to regulatory directors, because regulation is a really important part of this process as well. And we stress tested the leakage Routemap with a range of people. We then had meetings with the regional planning organisations, Ofwat, Environment Agency and DEFRA, and so there's been a lot of collaboration, a lot of consultation and communication through this process. And Glenn alluded earlier to the importance of actually, you know, what's it going to cost? Because it isn't going to be, you know, it's going to cost more. As Bob mentioned, as you drive leakage down, it costs more to hold it steady. And we are going to get to that point where for many years we've been putting that horizon off, where we're going to have to step up asset replacement or improve asset health to keep leakage at sustainable levels going forward. So trying to come up with some costs for that against the different interventions involved us develop some cost models, which I'll talk very briefly about in a minute, but also looking at background leakage. What is the significant impact of that? As we, if it's 50%, 60%, 70%, or even are we very close now in some areas? So I'm just going to run through a couple of slides to talk about that. In terms of cost modelling, I'm not going to say very much on this, but there's more detail in the report, and all the assumptions are in the report that were used. But we looked at it in terms of understanding steady state costs, how much it costs to hold leakage at different levels, and transitional costs, how much does it cost to drive it down. We needed to be able to do this over a range of different scenarios and interventions. So we basically used a whole series of levers. So if we look at each intervention, and I've put some examples up here, what impact does that have on the leakage breakout rate? What impact does that have on the number of leaks that are running at any one time? What impact does that have on the average flow rate from those leaks? What's the impact on the leakage awareness time, location time, the time to repair, and importantly, the background leakage? So if we can adjust those levers for each of those interventions, we can adjust our cost models to get some idea of what those future costs might be. And we've put some numbers in the leakage route map about that. But it's important to recognise that innovation is a big part of this route map, and one of the things that innovation will help is actually reduce some of those costs in the future. So we can only cost on what we know at the moment, but there's a great opportunity going forward to reduce those. We came up with some scenarios. We needed to look at a whole range of different scenarios, and we came up with 4. These are presented here and in the report. For each of those, we developed a glide path into the future to 2050, but equally important, the uncertainty around that glide path. And some of these scenarios started off very simple. The top left is limited low-hanging fruits. Can we do more of what we do at the moment? But some people say, well, we already do that. Yes, but the technology and the process are evolving so that you've perhaps got longer arms now to grab those lower-hanging fruit. So what can we do there? Because that's effectively doing more of what we do. Top right, I think, is smart networks. How can we use smarter technology to reduce leakage? How can we use smarter technology to make better repairs or more efficient and more effective repairs? Moving down to the bottom, data and asset focus was the bottom left, which is about data-driven approach, sharing with each other what works well, applying that knowledge to from a different, what we've learned before, applying it to a new situation. And innovation. Innovation is key, and you'll hear that word coming up many times. And then the last on the right is about progressive policies. How can we really, what happens if we can actually do more asset replacement? If we can resolve in the long term the challenge about customer supply pipe leakage? And it might be about ownership, it might be about a different solution. The technologies are evolving all the time, and so we need to be adaptable. And on that point, I'm going to hand over to Joe, who's going to take us through what the route map sort of looks like and some of those adaptive pathways.
It's a lot easier to hand over in Zoom, isn't it? Hi, my name's Joe Sanders. I'm Technical Director at RPS. It's great, again, as everyone said, to be here in person and to finally sort of present the work that we've been beavering away on for what seems like a lifetime, but I'm told is only about 12 months. But it's fantastic to actually have it here to present it to everybody. I know a lot of you have seen a lot of it already, but to actually be able to show everything to everybody is a great thing, and it's really sort of, we're very proud of what we've done, and hopefully you guys can see that it's a useful tool and a useful way to sort of push forward and take the industry to the next level. So hopefully everyone's fairly aware of what adaptive pathways are these days. They're starting to become the buzzword. The WRMPs, business plans are starting to talk about adaptive planning. How do we set the course but acknowledge that there's that potential change that we need to make? We need to make a shift every now and again. So our approach that we sort of set out was very much two-focused. You'll see along the top AMP7 delivery, AMP8 delivery. We've got to achieve the things that we said we were going to achieve. And I think that's the real sort of like key underlying, and that's why one of the first poll questions are, how are we doing? Are we on course to hit that 15% reductions across the board? But underneath that, there's lots and lots of different bits of work that need to get moving forward. There's some key questions that we've already identified. What is background leakage? What is customer side leakage? When do we need to sort of make these changes and adapt? We need to use the data and insight that we get on a day-to-day basis to better inform these decisions as well. Collaboration again, information sharing. Yes, the water industry is a monopoly-based industry, but how do we share to make sure that all of the knowledge in this room and wider comes together, that everybody knows everything almost? How do we sort of almost put competition to one side so that we get that information sharing and it's for the greater good of the industry rather than just an individual company? Different things, that's very different ways of looking at leakage than potentially we have in the past. And from those, we've got some pathways, and again, we'll show a couple of sort of potential pathways in the next few slides, but those will feed into PR24, the water resources management plans and the regional plans to say, this is what we need to do. These are the things that we're going to do. This is the route 1, this is the slight change on route 2, this is 2A, 2B, but also making a framework that says, okay, this is the point where we need to make a decision, and this is the point where we need to sort of hold our hands up and say, a change is needed. We need to make a minor course correction maybe. So you'll see that there, you've got to review these pathways as we go through AMP8, looking at them and saying, okay, are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are we getting the benefits that we thought we were going to get? And then, a bit of soul searching maybe, putting forward and saying, actually, we need to make that minor change. Now, I know, I've been a leakage manager. I know that, yes, you sort of like change on a day-to-day basis and sort of adapt to how you're doing it, but formalising how we're doing that, making sure that we're aware of these different things, and having that sort of embedded in the regulatory regime not only just means that it's not a gut decision anymore, it's a data-driven decision. It's a better understanding because of the information and the insight that we've got. And then we'll repeat it again. Unfortunately, with the 5-year AMP cycle, we'll need to do this again in 5 years' time, adapt the plans. But is it going to be a complete redo? One would hope that this gives us an idea of where leakage needs to go to 2050. Yes, different things will change. Pollution might change on the wastewater side. Asset health might change on the clean water side. There are lots of different impacts that will come and affect it. But from today, leakage is saying, this is where we want to go. This is where we're going to. We're going to have to adapt to some of the external bits, but hopefully we've got that 25-year plan that we can just modify rather than throw it out, start again with a clean piece of paper in 5 years' time. So maybe some of you will be familiar with these Routemap style adaptive pathway diagrams, which I have to say Glenn introduced me to, and they're great fun to play with. It lets you though look at a way of where do we change, where can we do these interchanges, where does the line stop, where does it get too expensive, where does it get, the risks become too high to say actually we're going to have to change what we do. It's a great simplistic way of looking at the different things that we can do. Not every station you can interchange. Not every sort of pathway is open to you at the beginning. Some of the innovations that we need for the sort of progressive policies, we don't yet know. But once those innovations are there, we've got to have that ability to sort of make that interchange, come on to the next line where it's a much cheaper and more risk-free option. And then hopefully by the time we get to the 2050 at the sort of the end of the timeline, all of these will get us to that point. They will cost a lot different, but they will get us to that point. And it's how do we balance those things up? So no one's going to go down a purely, I'm just going to do limited low-hanging fruit. That's not what the scenarios are there for. What it's there for is to say, okay, if you did just do all of these things, these are the things to sort of look at and to do. However, as Dean has said, there's no silver bullet. This will be a hybrid approach of many, many different bits of the toolkit, and it's deciding at what point these bits of the toolkit come in, and most importantly for the likes of Bob and Peter, what's the point at which they have to come in? When do we have to go to Ofwat and say, this has to come in at this point, otherwise we can't go on to this line. This line's now lost to us for 5 years. So some of the things that we'll be doing, again, optimise pressure management. There's a lot of pressure management out there. Let's squeeze out as much as possible without impacting customers' supplies. Again, it's one of those things that it can be done sooner rather than later. The infrastructure is mainly in the ground that needs to be adapted, but it can be used. Smart metering. Again, this is an average for all of the country. This isn't what every single company will do. Others will need to do smart metering earlier, others will push it later. This is where we're sort of like looking to. And then smart networks. Again, a lot of you have already got smart networks set up, beginning in trial areas, pushing out and becoming further. Where do we learn from those? How do we not make the same mistakes? Say, how do we share that information of this didn't work for us, but this did. This is what our network responded to with this type of smart network. Being open, being collaborative, supply chain working together as well. And then mains renewals. It's one of these things that we've sort of pushed back every 5 years and go, it's too expensive. We'll do it in 5 years' time. And then we get there and it's too expensive and we push it back. There's that realization that at some point background leakage will become unachievably too high for us to do what we're doing at the moment. And that will be that step change that we potentially need to do. We don't know when it will be, and it will be different for different companies because, as we've said, we don't fully understand where the background is. Where is that limit at where we can't do active leakage control anymore? Well, can't do active leakage control economically anymore. And then as we get sort of further on, we start to sort of look at this sort of supply pipe replacement sort of strategies. Is that adoption? Is it pseudo-adoption? Is it a different way of paying for supply pipe leak repairs? Is it a better understanding and a more sort of informed customer base that understands that this is their asset and they've got to look after it? How do we do that? There's many different decisions that will need to be made on that journey and many different pathways that will get us to many different solutions. We've got to pick the best ones for each of the companies and we've got to put that forward. It might be a unified sort of industry-wide selection, or it might be regional. Again, these are the things that we're going to have to do over the next 5-10 years to understand these things, to sort of push them forward. But there are some things that we need to do in the next couple of years. And the Routemap highlights these proposed commitments that the industry have done. And as I say, Bob and Peter have been very fundamental in shaping how these sort of commitments are there. We need that best value decision framework. We need to know when the decisions need to be made. When is it the best value, when it's not the best value. And those need to sort of, the mechanisms of how we do the adaptive pathways need to be designed, put forward, and ready for that PR24 submissions. We need to do information and knowledge sharing like days like today. There's a whole bunch of innovation that will be shared later on, and there'll be days like this that go through from now onwards. And it really is important that things like the Leakage Network, where the managers meet quarterly, really is that sharing sort of knowledge space. But it's not just sort of 18 representatives. It's on a person-to-person basis. It's not just in the water companies. It's the supply chain and regulators sharing knowledge backwards and forwards. It's making sure that we've almost got that open book analysis of how we're doing it. Badges at the door. This is a national thing that we need to achieve. There's some vital enablers that sort of come into that as well. And again, not to bang the drum once more, but we need to understand exactly what background leakage is. Not for sort of any accountancy purposes, but to understand when we need to change onto these different pathways. When do we need to sort of go, actually, we can't do active leakage control in the way that we've done it, in the way that we do it anymore. There's just nothing else left to go. Our arms, to use Dean's analogy, are no longer long enough to reach the stuff that we need to. The same is said for customer side leakage. Again, as Bob suggested earlier, there's a lot of leakage out there on that customer side. How do we sort of get the evidence base together so that we can have a proper conversation with the regulator about maybe supply pipe adoption or a different mechanism of using that? So we need to collect that data. As Glenn said, we need to understand the renewal selection process better. We're very good at selecting bursty pipes to renew. We need to select bursty and leaky pipes, all in one, asset health being an overarching view of the world. And if we're going to replace all these pipes, let's not put leaky ones back in. Let's put brand spanking new, non-leaky pipes into the network, joints that won't fail sort of in 4 or 5 years' time. Spending that little bit extra time QAing everything, little bit extra. These things should last 150, 160 years if we put them in properly. But if we don't put them in properly, they're a problem tomorrow. As we've already said, we need to have that decision on customer supply pipe and how we go forward with that. And again, that's the talking to Ofwat, EA, DEFRA, understanding what they are. And as Dean said, we've spoken to these people. They're open to that debate. They want to see the data. They want to understand what our thoughts are as an industry, what we need to do. From my point of view, the scale of what is needed from the supply chain is big. You'll have all sort of thrown work at a number of us in the room in the last few months, and we'll have all said, sorry guys, we haven't got any people. There is a big brain drain from the industry. As people retire, we need to get those graduates and the new people into the industry. We need to inspire people to come along, not just in the supply chain, but also into direct employment of the companies as well. We need to make sure we grasp these opportunities and show that leakage is a cool place to be. Maybe not cool, but better than what it is at the moment, shall we say. And we also need to sort of fully understand the costs. So we've done modelling at a national level. Every single company will need to then go away and have a look at exactly how their costs fit into the things that we're doing. And I think that's a really key sort of point that, again, we've done it at a national level. This is now over to some of you guys to start doing it at a more regional and also company-wide level. Unfortunately, doing mains renewals in the centre of London is very different from doing it in the middle of Wales. There are different costs, there are different drivers, there are different things that we need to think about, and hence there are different prices. So a few key messages for you all to sort of take away for today, and Bob's already mentioned quite a few of these, which is really good because, as you say, tell them what you're going to tell them again, tell them at the end. Leakage since privatisation has been positive, but we realise as an industry we need to do more. The NIC and the PIC commitments have shown that we really want to push this thing forward in the next 20 to 50 years. But at the same time, at the end of 2020, we were at the lowest level of leakage that we've seen historically. We call them the aspirations of 2030 and 2050, but they are achievable. Looking at all the modelling, it is doable. It's not pie in the sky, it's not an unreachable dream. However, it's going to take a step change. We're really going to have to think of these things. We've got to realise as a sector that reducing leakage costs money, and hence it costs customers money. Hence, we've got to make these things as efficient as possible. Every pound that we spend is a pound out of our customers' pockets, and we don't need to tell anyone at the moment how much that is becoming more and more of an issue with the cost of living increasing. However, innovation should help us reduce those costs. And Jez is going to come on in a few minutes and sort of talk around how we might do some of these innovations, how we might get sort of that push through. we need to reduce the risks to make sure that we're not getting into a more riskier situation. Like, I've worked in a water company. We are risk averse as an industry. I'm not saying that we need to be completely risk averse, but we need to understand those risks. We need to be able to quantify them. And that'll help us make the right decisions at the right time. And again, just to sort of reiterate it, that innovation will be a key enabler for this. It's going to help us achieve the 2050 goal, but it's also going to make it affordable for customers. And that's the big important thing. Customers have said they want us to reduce leakage. They tell us every time we do a willingness to pay survey. They also tell us that they don't really want to pay that much for us to reduce leakage. So we've got to make it as efficient as possible so that we're spending every pound in the most and best way possible. And there's collaboration across the sector as well. It's everyone in this room working together. It's not just one or two. It's not just the three of us that have put the roadmap together. It's making sure that we all work together. And again, as an industry, we will be able to achieve this, but it will be difficult. But hopefully, with us all working together, we will get there. So I will now hand back over to Frank. Oh, sorry, thank you. Sorry, apologies, my bad. The team would like to thank Bob, Peter and Stuart from Affinity, who can't be here today, for their sponsorship of everything that we're doing. Joe Parker, who's been the project manager and kept us on track, even when we've sort of moaned and groaned and written things at very late in the evenings. And also to Water UK as well for giving us the opportunity for doing it. But also to the number of people that we've spoken to in this room and the wider sector as well, that sort of gave their time freely, sort of challenged us, said, why are we doing this? How are we doing this? So, as I say, from the three of us and the companies we represent, thank you very much for all the support you've given us to put it together. So now I will hand over to Frank.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this has been excellent, Glenn, Dean, and Joe. And again, this piece of work has been very comprehensive. And as I mentioned before, it's drawn on a lot of expertise, information that is available. And over the last 20, 25 years, a lot of work has been done. And that information is being used now. And we start now finding areas where really we need to make a decision on to really make that step change. Not just for AMP8 and PR24, which is obviously an imminent process that we need to feed into, but it's the longer term. So thank you very much for what I thought was an excellent set of presentation, and that really sets out the detail of this piece of work and the route map. We've got 15 minutes of questions, so I think we got a roving mic to assist us with us. Got a couple of questions coming through on Slido, which is excellent, so please continue to use that. We really try to focus this series of questions on actually the route map, so what assumptions have been made. The next session, obviously, we get some views of the water company, so I'm sure you've got another set of questions potentially for these people about how they will be able to deal with that, what their view is on achieving it, and the way that they will use the route map to actually draw out their own plans for individual companies. And that's another key point. The route map is there to be used as a blueprint, but it doesn't give you all the answers. And some of those answers are very specific to individual water companies. Other are very much industry-wide. I just want to start off with a question around supply pipe and supply pipe ownership. Clearly, there's a bit of an elephant in the room there in terms of supply pipe leakage is increasingly a larger proportion of overall leakage. And we're reducing leakage quite successfully on our distribution network, transmission mains, reservoirs, etc. But supply pipe, the initiatives haven't really changed. So what assumptions have you made in the actual roadmap? I noticed that from 2014 there is a proposed, kind of in your route map, a proposed supply pipe replacement element in there. To what extent, and are we really being too conservative about 2040, which is obviously quite some time away from where we are now?
Do you want me to start?
Yep.
Okay, so it's a really good question, and it keeps getting raised, and Bob raised it earlier. Yeah, we're in a as a country as a whole, we've got we tend to put our meters at the property boundary, which means we can start to look at what's going on beyond the meter, which includes the customer supply pipe and what's being consumed in the house. However, we're still at around let's say 50% meter penetration across the country, and some companies have pushed further forward on that, some are further behind, and most meters are in the ground for billing purposes, but what we're starting to see over the last few years is that push to make those meters smarter, to get more granular data. We're also seeing innovations coming through where there aren't meters. So, you know, those properties that don't have meters, how can we get some idea of what's going on in that pipe beyond that property boundary? And that's, you know, those sort of innovations are all helping us to look and understand what's going on with customer side leakage. We looked at adoption of customer supply pipes in 2012, 2013 as an industry. DEFRA did a consultation. They came out and said, we can't really see the benefit. I think around the same time we saw the adoption of private sewers, and that seems to have gone remarkably well and without much incident. So adoption of supply pipes, you know, shouldn't be just put aside and say, well, that's been done and dusted. You know, there is a very big debate around that, I think. But also with the technologies that are being developed now and are being trialled and are being implemented by some companies to understand what's going on beyond that meter point in the supply pipe and in the house, we should be able to then say, well, how much is customer supply pipe losing us? And how much of that actually is consumption, which has to have a different intervention. It's not a find and a fix, it's more about behaviour, educating, etc., and intervening within the home. And we push the decision about supply pipes further down the Routemap because it gives us time. We don't need to make a decision now, but we need to recognise that actually we need to know more about it. And then let's see what innovations are coming. Do we adopt or not? There are probably going to be more solutions. If we know what's happening on every single supply pipe in the country, then perhaps there's a more targeted approach. I don't know what that targeted approach is at the moment, but I'm pretty certain as we go forward over the next 5 years, we'll start to know and see that more clearly. So that's why we pushed it down. It's there because we do really think it needs to be addressed and resolved in the long term. For no other reason than those supply pipes aren't maintained by anybody, and they will fall apart. And the poorer supply pipe materials that are in the ground have been falling apart. So it's going to be one of those things that is going to become more important because there is an asset catastrophe, if you like, on its way, because no homeowner really understands that they own that supply pipe and it's their responsibility. So yeah, we've pushed it that far down for that reason.
It wouldn't have been realistic to sort of put it in very sort of in the near future because there's so much more information needed, and then any kind of key decisions like that, it's going to take time to implement. So it's not to say 2040 is, you know, don't think about it until then. It's very much think about it now because it's very, very important, but then it's to allow a decade or even more to actually get to a point where there's the right decision is made, but it's starting to recognise that it's hugely important. So yeah, I think it really vital to recognise that point that it's pushed into the future. So that's part of making sure the achievement of the Routemap is there. You know, it is attainable. Yeah. So it's a key element of it, but recognising that it's a big decision.
Okay, just follow up from that. A question from the actual audience is, appreciate the regional differences, but does the industry understand the potential cost of supply pipe adoption? So I assume the question back to you is, to what extent did you take into account a cost that you believe is reasonable in your overarching kind of industry cost model?
Yeah, so we took an appropriate, or what we thought was an appropriate way of looking at that. But again, it depends on how we actually sort of adopt them and how we replace them. Like, again, sort of looking at the Dutch model where there's just one piece of pipe that goes from the main right up to a meter that's inside the property. There's no joints on that, so it's a very different sort of from a leakage point of view, it's a very different model. So we've made a sort of a midway assumption on that, but at the same time, that could be very much cheaper if we sort of if innovation comes in, or potentially a lot more expensive if some of the sort of the more nuances come in as well. So we tried to sort of make a pragmatic approach to that, but yeah, there's still quite a bit to do to get a firm grasp on exactly what the cost will be.
I think it's a key. There was, a reasonably extensive study done into the cost back prior to that 2013 DEFRA consultation. So there's plenty of material out there that's still sort of broadly relevant that we can use to sort of bring up to date. But it's what are those other options? As things move forward. Adoption might not be the right way, but in terms of is it the best value pathway for the customer, that debate I think needs to be had, involving a lot of the customers as well, because the alternative is perhaps, could we move? I always say to people the only fair way in terms of the customer side leakage issue for customers is either the industry adopts and then everybody gets the same thing. At the moment, every water company's got slightly different policies and there isn't that consistency nationally. You want to move to consistency, adoption's one way of doing that, or another is the customer takes ownership and people make a choice. Do they take a risk or do they go for an insurance policy? And it doesn't take much, I think, to sort of do the maths. If we're talking about a £5 a year or something of that magnitude for the industry to adopt compared to an insurance package that might be 30, 40 quid a year. So it's then those sort of things that the customer engagement will need to be sort of revisited and to properly understand the ownership. I don't know how you educate the customer to actually know that that's their asset. I think as an industry we've got to face up to that one and work out how to do it, because all the surveys say people don't understand they even own that asset. So it's
Okay, good. Let's move on. There's quite a few questions coming in, so thank you very much. You mentioned the role of the regulators and the fact that the regulators were they were one of your key stakeholders. So are there any plans to engage with regulators so that the leakage cost assessment in PR24 supports the delivery of outputs of the Routemap? I suppose there's a whole wider question around how you apply adaptive pathways within an M period when something doesn't go in a way that you expect it to go, and if that incurs additional cost, how do you deal with that? So if you're able to share us some of your discussions that you had with the regulators, because I'm very much aware they were a key stakeholder in this whole engagement process. Can you just limit it to maybe yourself, Dean?
Okay, I'll try and answer that very quickly. Yes, I think we found them very open and engaging, which is interesting. They wanted to understand the costs, clearly, and just very coming back to that, we use standard cost, TR61 cost for replacement, which is where we are now. But we also need to recognise that innovation is a key area where we can improve on those things and get more value. They were very, I think the regulators were they're never very forthcoming in these things. But one of the key things potentially is the whole thing about supply interruptions and taking people offline, and how do you do innovative solutions to asset improvement. And I think they talked about having room around that area for debate and discussion, rather than saying, well, it is how it is, and that's how it's going to stay. So I think there is room for discussion, and certainly talking to Water UK, this is a start of a process. This isn't going to be, here it is, over to you guys. I think that within Water UK, then there will be some leadership and some of these bigger questions can be driven through that agenda to have sensible discussions with the regulators about how is this going to be paid for, because it isn't going to be the same cost we spend at the moment. It is going to require more cost. And it is a balance with everything else that's going on within our industry and the world. How do we make that right choice? And that can't come from the regionality bit. I think there is certainly a central push to see that through. But then how does that get spread out to each company, and how do they adopt that for their PR24 planning, which isn't that far away? So hence some of those commitments have some quite short timescales to them.
Okay, thank you. There's quite a few questions coming in around background losses, and obviously you indicated yourself some of the key uncertainties are around things like background losses, supply pipe leakage, and cost in itself. Obviously there's some clear program there of do more on background losses itself, but how can we separate background losses from detected leaks, and what do you think is required to ensure that the next piece of work that we're doing on background losses, because every 5 years we do a background losses project, how can we now get a project running that actually gives us those answers, or gives us at least more certainty about background losses, because it's such crucial in terms of our level of leakage that can be achieved, our cost curves, etc., etc. So, and you can have a quick view on that. I'm also very much aware that we're going to have an excellent presentation later on background losses in the afternoon. So I'm sure we get some answers on there as well.
Yeah, definitely. As I say, like, hopefully Stuart's got some answers later in the afternoon. But I think it's very much that getting some of the. It's truly understanding how far we can go with active leakage control and different methods of active leakage control as well. And as I say, is it background, or is it just the boundary of the current technology that we're trying to sort of examine? We've called it background leakage because that's the normal sort of used term. But there's very much let's go in there, let's get some of our, it's not necessarily our best people that we would historically have sort of used, but it's making sure that we sort of use these technologies, understand what leaks we can find, repair those leaks, go back in. Can we find any more leaks? Go back in. There's certain zones that I know that certain companies have been looking at where they've sort of done that approach already. So some of the data's already out there that says actually it's much higher, or actually it's much lower. And then looking at the sort of the characteristics of those areas and going, yeah, okay, well, how do we then take these small sort of trial areas and extrapolate that out to the companies, the regions, and then the nation as well. So it's got to be that stepwise approach, but at the same time, we've got to make sure that we're not overly sort of biasing it by putting the best people onto there, because that's not going to give us a true understanding of what the actual background is, which I think historically some of those tests have sort of maybe under or overestimated due to the way that we've done those. So, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm going to overrun slightly because there's quite a few questions coming through, and I know the next session we've got a bit more scope. New networks. A couple of questions about new developments. So the question is, what assumptions have you made about leakage on new developments? I mean, in my view, surely within the model, at some stage, new network leakage should be zero. So what have you assumed in the actual route map and the cost?
Okay. We've assumed, based on a number of sort of recent pieces of work, we've been, a number of people in the room know we've been working on that subject. There's been other previous studies done by UCWIR, maybe a decade or so ago as well. There's quite a bit of material out there that says, and this is another one we need to be careful on the wording, because it can come across that we've got all these terrible new networks, which isn't the case. We've often got reasonable new networks in terms of the actual pipe, but jointing can be quite a key issue. So we've got, I think we've all probably seen across the industry areas where new networks have gone in and then we're having to do follow-up work afterwards. In other cases, new networks go in and there's very little problem. So it's an inconsistent picture. So we've made some assumptions there around the level of losses. It's nowhere near as leaky as the old network, but it's not leak-free by a long stretch either. So there's that sort of view that there's still work needed to be done in that particular area. So there's a lot of detail in the report for people who want to delve into sort of the approach methodology, but that's effectively it. We've got some concerns about the sort of jointing issues and some of the fittings, etc. And that's what we've based our sort of assumptions on. But there's more that could be done. Leak-free new networks are important because it's not going to affect your AMP7 delivery, but what it will do over 25 years, a relatively small number each year for 25 years will stack up to a pretty big number and make that achievement of the NIC target a real challenge. So it's one of those, it's almost like sort of ethically the right thing to do for the future generations is just to crack the problem in the next 5 years and not have yet another upward pressure on leakage to be dealing with. I think there's an assumption often with regulators that new network's not a problem. I think it's not to paint too black a picture, but we could do more, and I think there's some fairly quick wins that could be achieved in the next sort of, certainly in AMP7.
Okay. Going to follow up with last 2 questions. I know there's more questions coming through, but we saved them for the next session, so keep them coming in. Question for Joe, then, on the assumption that the industry is meeting their AMP7 targets, reductions by 2025. So a question from Steve, so thank you very much, Steve. What happens if we don't meet those targets? What happens to the Routemap?
Well, that's where we start the first adaptive pathway, isn't it? The assumption at the moment is that we will achieve that 15%. If we don't, then we need to change. Obviously, we need to learn from the lessons of why didn't we achieve the 15%. It's one of the underlying assumptions of the Routemap that we will achieve the 2025 targets. However, if we don't, there is that room in the Routemap because of the adaptive pathways to say, okay, we need to do a bit more of this or a bit less of this to make sure that we hit the PIC 2030 target in the most economical way possible. So yes, it's an underlying assumption that we've made, but if we don't, touch wood, we will. But if we don't, then there is that sort of like, that's just, we move on to the next route earlier than we would anticipate, that's all.
Okay. Just last question for Dean. With all the work that you've been doing, you've been breathing this piece of work now for quite some time. What is the thing that people can take away now that they can actually, what bit of insight does the Routemap give people now that they can take up tomorrow rather than wait for another adaptive pathway?
That's a good question. That horizon is getting closer, I think. If we look at 2030 as a target, in reality, it's just 5 years away because it will start in 2025. You're on a trajectory from here on to 2025. So it's going to be made a lot easier if you can meet that trajectory, for sure. So what can we do now to actually ensure that we do actually get to the target for AMP7? I think the other key message, I think, is collaboration, sharing and innovation. Yes, each company is going to be starting from a different position. It's going to have its own challenges. But there are enormous number of aisles of excellence, if you like, around the industry. People are trying different things. They're trying different innovations. And what we need to move away from is all trying them individually. 10 years later, we suddenly decide that actually this is quite a good idea, to sharing that information out. Identifying what works well in different situations. What can we do now to make things a little bit better? It's those low regrets things that you're looking to get in early. And do a little bit, I mean, it's like marginal gains, the wheels around her, as the British cycling used to say, a good reason why they were winning more races. What marginal gains can we make immediately? What can we understand about the network that will help us in the future? And how do we share and collaborate on that to actually help each other drive that down? And as Jez is going to put up some really interesting slides around innovation later. Just building up, Jez. Don't disappoint. But it is about that. We have some great talent in this industry. There are a lot of innovations coming around. We're being challenged constantly by more data being available. The supply chain has to react and be more responsive. We need to pick up these ideas and test them and share those results and help everybody else, drive their leakage down at the same time.
Okay, good. I'm going to close this session now. So thank you again, Glenn, Dean, and Joe. Really good set of presentations. Thank you very much audience for putting questions through. So if you can please stay where you are, we're going to now hear from the water companies. So we're going to find out a bit more their perspective of the actual Routemap and what it means for them as individual companies. So I would like to welcome to stage Jeremy Heath, who is the Innovation Manager for SES Water and is also the Aquair Leakage Research Program Lead, Mr. Innovation. And David Jacobs, who is the Leakage Strategy Manager for Anglian Water. So please, Jess and Dave, if you can make your way. I think you're going to start your presentation, Jeremy. So, yeah, I will sit down. So thank you very much, Jess, and let's welcome Jess.
So, fantastic to hear about the Routemap. That's actually up on the website now. I've just seen that, so that's there and available. People can go and download it. But of course, don't do that at the moment because you're going to be listening to us. Okay, so a lot of challenges, and you've heard about the challenge there about innovation. And this is the real danger, that innovation suddenly becomes the magic pixie dust that is going to solve every problem out there. And one of the reasons I do my role in terms of leakage is because about 5 years ago, I stood up here at the conference and said, look, leakage is complicated. There's no silver bullet. It was at that conference that we coined that term, PALM, prevent, aware, locate, and mend, and said, we've got to be good at all of these things. If we're going to drive down leakage, we've got to solve all of those problems. And we've got to work together and collaborate to solve those, and innovation will be a part of that, but we've got to steer that really carefully. So, where do we go? Okay, look, we've looked at the Routemap, or at least you're going to be downloading that, but you've seen the kind of overview. It is going to require collaboration and innovation in the UK on an unprecedented scale. We're good at sharing. Okay, I really like being part of the leakage industry because we do share, we talk, we discuss. Last night, everybody's sitting there and we're desperately trying to turn the conversation around from what are you doing at work at the moment, because everybody is talking about what they're doing and what they're achieving. Great, but we've got to step that up a level. We have to collaborate. 2 years ago, we went out there and we did the innovation heat map for the first time. We got everybody to share from the water companies. What are you working on? Where are your innovations coming from? 320 plus projects across the water industry mapped for the first time, so that for the first time we could go, right, here's where most of the research is occurring. Here's where the gaps in our knowledge are. Here's where we need to focus more. Brilliant. We need to keep doing that kind of stuff. Sharing and collaborating together. There are limited opportunities to get that knowledge from outside the UK. We've had this conversation, you've heard about it already. We've talked about things like semi-structural liners and the fact that the 3-hour interruption means it's really difficult for suppliers bringing stuff from outside the UK into the UK. And I will be honest, I predicted a few years back that because of where we're going with 15% leakage reduction, that the UK would become the go-to place again for leakage innovation. And that's happening. There are companies I'm aware of inside this room who are now producing world-leading solutions in leakage innovation, where the rest of the world is coming and going, how on earth are you doing that? We are really starting to get cutting edge again. So there are things that we can bring in from outside, but we've got to do a lot of development ourselves. And that means drawing together our research programs. It means bringing the Aquair program that I lead. Okay, the UK Water Industry Research Programme, joint funded programme, been going on for years, producing lovely, thick paper reports, okay? It's really useful information. What we're doing, by the way, on that one, and I'm talking later about Aquair, it's the last session of today, and I know so many of you are changing your train times now so that you can be there for it, which is great. But the Aquair program produces really vital research. It's that R&D first level stuff. But what we need to do is then link that up as well. In the next session after this, you'll be hearing about innovation in the UK, and you'll be hearing about the innovation streams that are coming through. We need to link those together. but then also tying in the company programs, because do you know what? All the innovation isn't coming through those innovation streams. It's been happening for years in the companies. We've seen some great innovations coming through for the companies. We need to link those through. And then also the third party and all you suppliers sitting there going, we do innovation. I know you do. Fantastic. We need to link together all 4 of those streams together and get a holistic program in the UK. So that's what I've been doing. So I sat down with the 3 of them here, and we had a wonderful, geeky afternoon, okay, of talking leakage innovation. And we went through the report, and I broke it down and said, okay, as far as I can see, these are the kind of themes that we need to be addressing. Okay, and I've got 9 themes there. And then I went through and said, okay, so look, we need to look, in each of those, we look at the leakage route map from Acquia. Okay, that's already out there. We look at the innovation competition. How can we start to use the catalyst, the transform project coming through from there? We look at the water companies and their responsibilities, the following of best practices, that consistency reporting, and the adoption of new techniques. And then we look also at the third parties, and by that I mean not just supply chain, but regulation as well, and how we bring them into the party as well. And so what I've actually done is I've gone through and I've mapped that out. And so here's an example. This one here is for quantifying background leakage. And I've said, okay, so what do we need to do with the big question? With the Acquia big question, where do I need to start to put my analysis in there? And I've started to note down my thoughts on that, and you can see that there. The innovation competitions, where am I aware of innovation stuff coming through in those competitions that will be really useful for what we're doing? But in addition, what kind of things do we need to develop through the innovation competition? You'll be hearing about that from Ben coming up, and he'll be talking about that, but we need to drive that through and say, right, here are the solutions that we are looking for. Fund this stuff for us. Water companies, what do we need them to be doing? Okay, so to quantify that background leakage, water companies, what do we require of you? And then finally, and this is the bit where all you suppliers are going, get my camera out, take the photos now, because suppliers, this is what we're going to need from you and from our regulators as well. Here's the questions that we need you to address as well. And the key bit here is bringing that all together holistically, so that we start to do that all together. So our research is not fighting one another. We're not duplicating it all over the place, but the Acquia program, producing our paper reports, feeds into the innovation competition, producing widgets, feeds into the third party, your supply chain, who are going, look, we need to bring this in as well. And the water companies are doing a great job of adopting that and rolling out. And you're laughing and chuckling, going, do you know how tough that is? Yes, we do. Yeah, we do. We know how tough it's going to be to do this. But as an industry, we've achieved a massive amount already. 20, 30 years ago, we were the place to come for leakage, and we proved that it could be done. And now is the time again for us to step up to the plate. Because if we get this right, and we start working like that, we will not just change leakage in the UK, we will change it in the world, because everybody will want to see what we've done and how we've done this. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. David, do you want to take the roster, please?
Thanks, Jez. Thanks, Frank. Morning, everyone. Lovely to be here this morning. David Jacobs. I'm Leakage Strategy Manager at Anglian Water, and I've been part of the steering group working with these guys to develop the PIC roadmap. And I'd like to say thanks to all the hard work you put in, because it's a good report, I think. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so just taking you through how we as a company intend to use the principles that are set out in the route map, really to drive our leakage strategy and drive our leakage strategy as part of the water resource management plan that's in the process of developing, and also the PR24 process. So we saw this this graph earlier on Glenn's slides, I think, showing the relative positions of the companies in the UK in comparison to the two target lines, showing the PIC target and the NIC target. Now Anglian, well, the further to the left of the graph, down the bottom you are, the lower your leakage is. Now Anglian is in the cohort down towards the bottom left. So we're already doing quite well, but it doesn't mean to say we can take our foot off the gas when it comes to managing leakage and driving leakage down. In our region, our supply-demand balance is in deficit over the next 25 years. We've got increased growth, proximity to London, especially in the south of our patch. We're seeing abstraction license reductions increasing, starting this AMP, and they continue to increase into future AMPs. And we're going to see impact from climate change. So all that means less water available for us to abstract, but more demand for it, more people wanting to use it. So leakage reduction remains an important and will remain an important part over the next 25 years, part of our maintaining our security of supply for our customers. So we do plan to exceed both the PIC and the NIC target in that timeline, and are building our plans to do that. Our strategy to date has been to maintain leakage in low leakage zones using find and fix, and to use capital interventions to drive leakage down in higher leakage zones. So things such as optimisation schemes, asset rehab, and metering. And we plan to continue that strategy into the future. Okay, so before we can think about driving leakage down, we need to look at, well, what do we need to do to keep leakage level in well-performing, in good-performing DMAs? So we have to keep, in those DMAs, we have to keep on top of the failure rates that we're seeing caused by the impacts of weather. We know that we've had, in the last 10 years, several severe weather impacts. We've had the winter of 10-11, which we saw on the graphs earlier. And then we had the beast from the east and the hot, dry summer of 2018. Now the graph you can see on the left, that shows our repair numbers that we've had to repair over the last 10 years. And that includes leaks found proactively and also leaks phoned into us by the public. And it includes all leaks, so leaks on our assets, on the mains, on the services, but also leaks on customer supply pipes. And you can see that number of leaks that we're having to repair is steadily increasing. There's a couple of interesting things on the trend. You can see after the winter of 10-11, there was a spike in repairs needed, and it then went back down again after a couple of years. And then you can see the year of the beast from the east and the hot, dry summer of 2018, it's gone up again, and it's stayed up. Now, I do wonder whether are we going to see a reduction again this year, maybe, as the sort of the impact of the beast from the east and the hot summer play out, or is that going to carry on growing? It's a question that we don't know the answer to. Looking at the makeup of bursts in that graph, actually burst mains have been pretty stable over that period. We're managing that by optimisation schemes, the protective effect of pressure management is helping to reduce numbers of bursts, and also by targeted asset replacement. So that means that actually the driver for that increase is the smaller assets. So it's leaks on services, both on our comm pipes, on the customer side, and also on the stop taps and the boundary boxes that the meters sit in. Now, what that means is, so we're finding more leaks, but they tend to be smaller volume leaks, so they have less impact on overall leakage level. However, if there's a leak at the bottom of the customer's drive in the meter chamber, it's highly visible to them, and they expect us to fix that, just as they would expect us to fix a burst main. Now, overall resource numbers in the find and fix arena, we've probably got some of the highest numbers within the industry. We don't think there's much more to be gained by driving more resources into that area. If we do, it becomes increasingly inefficient. So we're going to need to manage this by finding new ways of protecting the network from bursting and more efficient ways of fixing the leaks that we do have. Okay, so moving on to the problem DMAs and how do we drive leakage down in those problem DMAs. So the PIC report sets out some useful scenarios, which we've seen earlier, in terms of options that companies can pick. So I've already said increasing levels of ALC for us. We don't really think there's much more mileage in doing that. And we've kind of got to the level that we think we're efficient. If we go much further, it just becomes increasingly expensive. So we're starting to do items lower down the list. Pressure management, optimisation, smarter networks. We've had an extensive optimisation programme for the last 10 years. But actually looking at the schemes that we've got available, we think that by the end of this AMP, we'll have done all the schemes that are cost effective to do. So that's exhausted as well. So we need to move into other areas further down the list. So data and asset focused improvements. This AMP, we're starting to put our smart meter network in. We've currently got somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 smart meters in. By the end of the AMP, 1 million smart meters will be in. And that's going to give us some fantastic data to help answer some of the questions that we've seen earlier about supply pipe leakage and really what's the balance between supply pipe leakage and network leakage. We've also got big sensor networks, hydrophone networks, and advanced pressure monitoring, which you're going to hear about more this afternoon. Big networks of sensors. We need to get all of that data into one place, all communicating with each other to get the best possible value out of it. And we're not quite there yet with that. But I think even doing all of that, as we get out past AMP8, if things stay as they are at the moment, we will be looking at asset replacement. And that's expensive, probably not affordable for our customers. I guess the challenge for us will be making best use of the data that we've got to really target the asset replacement on just the assets that need replacing. So I think in summary, I think it is achievable for us, but costs at the moment, will be the blocker, and we really need the innovation to drive costs down to make it affordable and achievable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David and Jess, for those very short but very pertinent presentations. I would like to invite Paul Taylor as well, and you can sit on one of those uncomfortable chairs at the end. And Paul is a leakage manager for Severn Trent Water, but he's also one of the key members of the Water UK Leakage PIC steering group. And Paul is also a representation, or he's chairing the Water UK Leakage Management Forum. And actually, I want to start with a question for Paul. Paul, you obviously chair the Leakage Managers Group, which is a very proactive group, meets regularly to discuss any pertinent issues, and in terms of collaboration, just highlights again that as an industry we're collaborating very well together. But what are you going to do about, now this roadmap has been published, so how do you keep this live? What are you going to do with your Leakage Managers Group and as a chair to make the roadmap happen?
Yeah, okay, good morning everybody. Yeah, I think we need to take that route map into the network. We, as people have said already, we meet on a quarterly basis. It is water company practitioners that meet, eat, breathe, sleep, leakage, and we talk in an open and honest way about leakage performance, things that are working well, things that aren't working so well, what are people trialling. And I think we're trying to deep dive some of those topics. Many companies have invested in acoustic loggers, for example. Many companies have trialled satellite imaging, for example. And we try and deep dive into those to learn what's working well, who's had successes with it, who have not had so much success with. So it's a good network, and those are just two examples. And I don't think, the Leakage Network is one of many Water UK networks. There are others, and I think, as Jez said, about this holistic approach to collaboration going forward and data sharing. And I think this is a point where we can really push on with those networks, particularly if we're going to get to a point of data sharing, which has been, I think in the past, it's been data sharing for a project, an upgrade project or a flood project. We've seen it around hackathons, a new way of sharing that. But if we're going to share data around the network more, then we probably need to coordinate the structure of those meetings. And I want to talk to Water UK about that, and how we get a bit more coordination and a bit more support from Water UK to do it. Because those networks, a little bit in isolation, there's the Leakage Network, there's a number of others, but we don't get together too often to talk about what we're doing and that holistic approach. And I think just to point on the supply chain. So gave those two examples of where we've tried to collaborate, and we've talked in detail about what's worked well, what hasn't worked so well. But I would definitely welcome the supply chain wanting to do that. So the acoustic logger company or the satellite imaging company leading those benchmarking sessions, as well as water companies trying to lead them, trying to do it together.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. That's very, very useful. How the Leakage network can actually accelerate some of these collaboration and individual key projects. I've got a question. Look at us, a really diverse group of people here.
Yeah.
And even looking around the room, and I must say I've attended quite a few Leakage conferences over many years, and I don't think the group has changed. Yeah? I mean, Bob mentioned the last 40 years. I don't think we've changed a lot, and we're the most non-diverse group in my view. Now, we know that diversity is enormously beneficial. The task that we've got at hand here can only be achieved through getting a diverse group of people joining us. They're the future. That new way of thinking is going to make those step changes. Doing the same thing again is not going to give us the change. It's not going to deliver those big changes that are required. And diversity is absolutely key to that. So it's not just a question for you as a group, but since you represent the group, can I have a couple of views on you, how we can actually make sure that Leakage becomes sexy again and make sure that we draw on that talent that we've got across the UK and beyond and really assist us in making that step change. So, Jess, can I start with you?
Yeah, great. Yeah, we do look like the world's worst boy band up here, don't we? So I think, it's really interesting. I was looking, again, about, 5 years ago, I was looking at the leakage industry and I was going, everybody at that time was going, yeah, we're really struggling with getting people to do active leakage control. And I was going, forget active leakage control. I get that that's a struggle, and I'm not suggesting that it's not. But the bit that we will really be concentrating on in years to come will be analytics. Okay? And the sea change that we are seeing is the amount of data that we are now receiving as companies and how we analyze that data. Okay? And for many of you, leakage practitioners out there, you know that the key members of staff that you have got are the mathematicians, are the analysts, are the people like that who can take that data and say, this is what it means. And so for me, that's getting really involved with STEM programs and everything else like that. It's about going out to the universities and going, look, you've got maths graduates, you've got people coming through from these programs that have really got great technical understanding and really want to analyze stuff. Here's some of the best data. Here's some really interesting data patterns. Here's some stuff that we are still struggling to understand what it means, and get those people engaged and involved. And that we start to get the technical people coming out from universities going, I want to work within the water industry because you guys have got some of the most challenging and interesting problems that we can solve at the moment.
Yeah, and I think if we can get the data scientists but can translate that into the subject matter, I think that's the real sweet spot that we need to try and get to.
I think the challenge, as well as keeping people in the leakage arena, we have got quite a diverse team at the junior level. What tends to happen is they get poached for other roles that they get rewarded for better, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So that needs to be addressed.
It's one of those problems. You data scientists sort of pull the industry. The water industry isn't the most sort of lucrative for them when they can go into insurance and medicine and other sectors that are far better paid, and that is a real challenge for us as an industry. We've got sort of I'm sure Joe's will elaborate on the challenges around field staff and the pull to sort of other roles, whether it's HGV driving and other areas. Suddenly, something becomes more appealing because the government are pushing it for another reason. And I think it's an issue we need to collectively. That's not just people in this room, but as regulators as well. It's how do we actually make this work? Is it sort of an upskilling? So actually, there's a sort of a better career path ahead of people. Have we been guilty of lots of people at sort of cheaper salaries when actually we need to get some intelligence and shift the approach? So we've perhaps got some more skills with the technology that can do a lot more with fewer people, but they're higher skilled and higher qualified people. So I think there's a huge question there that we need to answer, isn't there?
I think so. I think when I look at our company, over 50% of our staff come from that data science talent pool, and we constantly ask the question, can we afford to get these people? Because let's face it, they are paid more in finance and those areas. And when we talk to the people we bring in, whether it's at graduate level or at more senior in sort of software development or data science, one of the things that's attractive about this industry is there's some real tangible problems to be solved. It's not just a handle turning exercise. There are some real difficult things, difficult challenges. It's data rich. We've got 20 years worth of data we can look back at for DMAs that have been in place for that long. That's a huge amount of data that can be used to try and look at how we resolve some of these challenges. And it's getting that interest there, I think, to encourage people to come and say, I want a challenge, but I also want to work in somewhere where, you know, we care about the environment. You know, what we're doing is about saving water so that our future generations have water and a better environment to live in. So it's partly about getting people through STEM, but it's also about us as an industry saying, look, this is a really interesting area. There are some huge things you can do in this area without having to walk around the streets at 2 a.m. in the morning, you know, which quite frankly isn't everybody's cup of tea. But yeah, I think we've got to make it sound interesting, not sound like we're trying to do something just to hit a target. This is actually making a difference to future society.
Yeah, I think definitely the social media age of, have we got a PR problem of, we call it leakage, and we call these things in different ways. Like we were talking about effluent reuse this morning over breakfast, like we called it just sort of, what was it, enhancing the natural cycle. Like all of a sudden it's a very different way. So do we need to change the sort of the way that we're talking about these things? I was talking to my old school for 175 18-year-olds that had never thought of the water industry as a potential sort of thing, but the fact that there's that environmental sort of bonus as well, as I say, there's the tangible sort of nature of it. It's actually I'm passing something forward. I'm doing something for the next generation, as well as helping people now. I think is a really big part of people that is really sort of, it's showing that maybe the financial isn't there, but the rest of the side, the rewarding nature of it that we all know and love, really is a huge part of it, and really sort of something that we can build on as an industry.
Okay, thank you. And just a follow-up question and for well, let's say David, how do we then extend that engagement to our supply chain? So, I mean, you mentioned some really good initiatives that you're doing to reduce leakage by looking at smart metering and so on. So how do we accelerate that, and how do we proactively engage the supply chain? I mean, we've got some wonderful presentations next door, and please visit those stalls. They're a key part of that. So how can we do that they not seem to be left behind or being isolated and they have to pick up individual companies, but really collectively we engage the supply chain?
Yeah, and I think that has tended to be the way that we've acted with the supply chain before. We've all done individual trials, which take time, and they all come to slightly different conclusions. I think trying to coordinate that approach to accelerate the adoption of new technology is key. Yeah.
And what is your view about bringing in incentives to reward the supply chain for example, introducing leakage reduction, target-based contract incentives to really make that step change and drive things further? I'll start with you, and then I'll go over to Jess, who's desperate to answer.
I mean, it's interesting. Measuring the benefits of some of the things that we do is quite often a challenge. You make an intervention in a zone. How do you disentangle the impact of that intervention from all the other stuff that's going on in that zone, the impacts of the climate? So it can be quite challenging and become a cottage industry if you're not careful in terms of assessing actually the effectiveness of what you're trying to do if you've got contractual commitments based upon it. So I think that is challenging to do.
Jess?
Yeah, I think there's a few things we can be looking at there. So I think number one is, one of the things that I hear again and again, I have to say at this conference, is concerns about framework agreements. Because when you're in a framework agreement, you can encourage that company that you're with the agreement to innovate, but it's really hard for outsiders then to come in because they get the same question, no, we've got a framework agreement. I'm aware that some companies have done some really innovative stuff, and I know that Anglian have actually done some really great stuff in terms of how you manage your acoustics and things like that, and in terms of how you manage your framework agreements, so that it does encourage other people coming in and yet protects those who are already part of that agreement, okay? And I recognise those of you in framework agreements are going, we desperately want to keep them, I understand that, But at the same time, we need to make sure that those are adaptable and able to drive that kind of innovation coming through. Okay, so that's not a blocker. I think that's certainly something we've got to address as an industry and find better ways of writing that. And that's a little bit of this collaboration and sharing, and you guys going, okay, this is how we've managed to do that. I think the other area I'm really interested in is in terms of things like contract agreements. And, you know, again, we come back to PALM, prevent, aware, locate, and mend. And mend is one of the areas where we've really got to start pushing this. We've got to drive down those repair times. And I think part of that is with the latest technologies coming through is starting to prioritise those leaks and looking at some really innovative contracts with our suppliers. So rather than paying them to repair a leak, is we go, okay, if you can repair it in a certain time, we'll pay you this. If you take longer, there's other clauses that then come in and things like that. So in fact, we then start to prioritise our leakage and really get our contractors, rather than just going out and saying, my job today is to repair a leak, it's my job is to repair the leaks that have been running longest, that are running fastest, and get those ones done as a priority. And we start to come up with different contracts like that.
Okay, just a follow-up question on that. Then, so how do we ensure that we've got the right relationship with councils in regards to street works, entry permits, and so on? Jess?
And a lot of that will be providing evidence as well. So councils, don't get me wrong, councils get it. They do. They are infrastructure companies themselves, in effect, that they have the roads and they're just concerned about damage to roads and things like that and how much you're going to be interfering with their business, with their running as well. So once we can start to demonstrate that actually this is the size of that leak and this is how that leak is going to grow, suddenly it's a different discussion with the council of, as opposed to, we need to dig up your infrastructure, it's suddenly we're on a stage where we're going, look, we've got a strong prediction here that this is how that's going to affect your infrastructure over time. So the longer you leave us out and say, no, actually, you guys can't come in for 2 weeks, we can then start to demonstrate, actually, this is how that leak's going to grow and this is the effect it's going to have upon you and potentially, you know, on car drivers and people like that as well. So again, I hate to say it, but it does come back to starting to get that data and that deeper analysis where we start to get a better understanding of what's going on below ground, and we can start to do that kind of predictive stuff as saying this is how that's going to go.
Okay.
And I think as well, it's sort of building on that and like the innovation of why we're digging up the roads. Like, can we fix it internally anyway? And I think, the fix the roads sort of situation that's probably going to be for the next 5-10 years, but if we can then sort of maybe inject something or send a robot down that Glenn always talks about, that we could then fix the main within it, and doesn't mean we have to sort of dig the hole in the road, or we can dig it in a more appropriate place so that we can do that, and at the same time probably keep customers on supply at the same time. These are the sort of innovations with the mends that we've got to look for.
That's it. Innovation's got to help with that council-type relationship question as well. You know, at the moment, it sort of can be very much turn up, traffic management company turn up and put about 100 signs out, and then somebody will turn up and dig a hole, and the hole will probably stay open for a day or two before there's reinstatement. It's, you know, can the technology move it to a position where it's a completely different operation? You know, having a conversation with the council to say, okay, we're going to go in after peak time. Actually, we can get this thing done in 4 hours and be cleared off. You know, it's how can the innovation help there? Otherwise, you end up, those of the people in the room that have got kids of a certain age will probably be familiar with the Peppa Pig cartoon, Mr. Bull and digging up the road. You know, how do we change that? And that's really key, I think, area for innovation to focus on, because repairs, after all, are one of the big spend items in what we do in managing leakage and fighting natural rate of rise. It's still a huge spend element in there. So that's, if you want to pile some effort into innovation, that's got to be one of the top priorities.
Yep. Okay.
Can I just pile back in again, Frank, as well? One of the examples I often quote on that is Tesla. So a mate of mine had a birthday recently. We hired out a Tesla for him. He'd never driven one. He wanted to have a go. So we had this Tesla for a weekend, and he's driving around. We're driving down the motorway, and he goes to change lane, and the car will not change lane. The sensors on that car had detected someone was sitting on his offside, and it actually refused to move and put him in a dangerous position. Now, imagine that technology trickling down to all of our cars over the next 10 to 20 years. And suddenly, we have engineered out crashing. We've engineered it out. We've not changed our road infrastructure in any way. What we have done is changed how we move around that infrastructure. That's where we've got to start looking in terms of our innovation as well. And I agree with you completely about this idea of how we how we put robots down pipes, how we do all of these kind of technologies, about how we pressure manage within our areas. Effectively, we're not going to change our entire mains network in the next 10 to 20 years. We know that. Certainly, I'd like to increase that rate, but we're not going to change it. So therefore, what we've got to start doing is think about how we pass water down our pipes and how we can limit transients, calm our networks down, make them less likely to burst, yeah? And then when they do burst, we've got those technologies to be able to repair them easily.
Okay. Talk a lot about technology. Haven't talked a lot about customers. So how do we engage our customers and other key stakeholders that are around that customer side of things? And I think as part of the engagement, you might have engaged CC Water and others. So maybe a question for you, Dean. How do we ensure that we proactively continue to engage customers about wastage, which is leakage actually is, and also about affordability? Sorry, Dean.
No, it's fine. That's fine. I knew you'd throw an awkward one at some point. I think how do we engage? Having an informed engagement, I think, is better. And I think there was also a question about our appetite for metering. And I think one of the we know very little about how our customers behave in reality. If we don't put a meter on the end of their pipe, how do we know what they're using as a customer? We tend not to engage them on that front, and if we had that information, there's a reason why retailers spend an awful lot of money getting information on what we spend our money on as consumers of products. So I've always been an advocate for smarter metering. I think it will help, and it is a potential solution for some in this route map. Given that information, you can be more proactive with customers and say, your consumption has increased or your demand has increased. Let us help you identify whether it's a problem we can help you with on the supply pipe, or do you need some help and support in how you actually drive your consumption down? And that helps us as an industry in a number of ways, because it's about reducing demand. Leakage is one part of that, but also we've got reduced PCC and household consumption as a performance commitment as a sector. And if we can use that information in a way which is engaging, and we're not sending out paper bills to people twice a year, that we're engaging them through a process of portals or apps, and everybody uses their phone for everything these days. Can we use that to help engage and help them solve their problems quicker? So vulnerable customers are a really key part. How do we make sure they've got a resilient supply to give them the water they need? And let's remember, of course, that water is about sanitation and hygiene as much as it is about what we drink. And that's a really, this is all about ensuring future water supplies. And customers are really important in that, so we've got to engage. And if we can give them information which helps them, then perhaps they can help us in our solution. And we do see, when we look at case studies around the world, how do you tackle that problem of customer X has a toilet that's leaking? At the moment we think it's leakage, but if we can detect and help them discover, by a process of your consumption's gone up, can you just check your toilets? Are any of them running continuously? Yes or no. Get that bit of information back. That gives the water company a bit of information they can act on and say, okay, it's more likely to be in the house, or it's more likely to be on the supply pipe. We can send an appropriate team out to have a look. So I think it's about how we change our approach and how we make use of all the data that is coming in, linking all that data together, and let's make the customer part of that water network. Yep. Not just somebody we push water to, but they're actually part of that, and they're part of the solution.
I'm just going to give you another question, Glenn, and you can elaborate.
I'll answer that bit. I've just got a bit I'll add to that as well.
Yeah, there's a question from the audience around, obviously, there's a housing crisis. We get so many new build homes over the future years, and we talked about new builds and the importance of leak-free systems. So the question is, are building regulations keeping pace with water use efficiency, materials and fittings installation quality? So I know that WRC, obviously, with their regulatory side of things, fittings, so what is your...
I think no. There's a lot more that could be done in that new development space in terms of efficiency and practical experience. As it's often some of the new properties that you sort of are seeing that in theory, you know, fittings have achieved standards, but actually the practices in terms of installation, etc., are there, and things are failing within fairly short periods of time. So there's far too much sort of going wrong in the system today. So I think that's an area that just needs a good look at. We talked earlier about the leak-free new networks, but I think the whole water efficiency piece, you know, we're compared to other parts of the world, some of the things we're involved with as a business are looking at, you know, the Middle East and some of the practices there around reuse and recycling, and there's a lot more sort of going on around the world. We're still doing the same old, you know, install sort of water networks generally. I'm not saying there aren't examples where recycling and reuse are being looked at, because there are, but it's not widespread in the UK. You know, I think that thinking could really move up a sort of a notch or two if we sort of wanted to, and there's that leak-free new network element. But I think generally we could really push on, and if we're not careful, that is where the UK could actually fall a little bit behind other parts of the world where the drivers are greater. So the other bit, just adding to that information piece, was key, and how do you engage with customers? We can ask them some really dry questions about, you know, are you prepared to pay an extra £1 on your water bill for some extra leakage stuff and things like that, that it's quite challenging. How do we actually get people engaged? I think information was key. And we need to balance off. There's obviously a lot of thinking at the moment about security and data. Equally, there's a lot of benefit if you take some of the data science type things, you know, your Kaggle routes, and sharing data with academics and data scientists, and thinking what's appropriate to share, and not just taking that completely risk-averse view as an industry that, you know, we can't share that. Actually, is there a way we can just anonymise things and protect the security, but actually allow wider communities of people access to data, that set them the interesting challenges? You know, you go and you get the Kaggle challenges, you know, you can get $50,000 if you solve this problem. Do more of that stuff. So actually it takes leakage into a different arena. Get school kids, university students involved. I think there's a load of engagement that's needed that isn't just directly dealing with the customers day to day, going and doing the talking to customers and the, you know, your boring questionnaire type routes and things like that. I think really actually engaging with them so they understand the problem, because when people are more informed, they're more likely to come up with some interesting challenges, solutions. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's linked together with some of these questions that we could think outside the box a bit more with.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think water efficiency I think at the moment is a difficult one to crack. The savings are relatively small from a sort of product deployment point of view, but you do get some great data, plumbing losses, as you say, occupancy, which is, you know, a high uncertain number in the water balance. You can get actual occupancy at a property level. So I think it is about the technology engagement, the apps, making it a bit like the energy industry in that respect. You know, a little device on your windowsill that tells you what you're using and how you're using it, and linking that to energy use as well.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Just a question on innovation from the floor. So, how do you match the need for innovation with the proposed pace of change? New solutions are fantastic, but how do you bring your workforce with you? Joe?
Yeah, I think that's been there a number of times when we've not brought the workforce with us, and that just causes issues. I think it's engagement from top to bottom. I think it's understanding what the problem that the workforce has and bringing a solution to it, rather than bringing a solution without a problem and finding a problem for it within the workforce. And I think it's there, the rate of change is there. These guys, as I say, people have already said, we sort of send them out with a pole and a bit of wood on it, when everything else in their life is on a mobile phone, or sort of like Google Glasses, or all of these other things that they sort of innovate with, and yet the tools we give them are like haven't changed for decades and decades. So it's moving that thing forward, and I think the workforce as a whole, as I say, definitely talking to some of my colleagues in that sort of asset survey style of sort of work, really do sort of like, they love the new tech and sort of like looking at it. And I think we're getting out of that habit of innovation being, oh, it's replacing my job. It's that sort of like mentality that we're now seeing is very much, oh, it's actually enhancing my job. I can get around 10 or 15 points of interest rather than just walking around and not finding a leak all day. Now, if any of us that have done it, like walking around and not finding anything all day is soul destroying. And so when you sort of show them that actually using this piece of technology, you can really sort of like push it on and think about it in a different way, that you're going to find something every day. You're going to find that leak. It's going to be sort of, you're going to have a rewarding day no matter what. I think it is really, really positive, and you see the sort of the feedback you get from the workforce in that respect is fantastic. So it's how you frame it to them, and it's, as I say, taking them along with the journey rather than just enforcing it on them, I think is really, really important.
Yeah. Okay. Got a couple of more questions. So I think there's an overarching question about other performance commitments. Yeah, we talked very much about a route map that was solely about using, obviously, various leakage type related initiatives. We mentioned interruption supply, we mentioned metering. We've got obviously other drivers, water quality, etc., CMAX. How do we ensure that we build a route map that takes into account those multiple benefits? And
So
this is quite a fundamental question, because it comes back to what are we able to afford? Yeah, we've got so many challenges. Yeah, we talked about waste on the other end, we talked about plastic, carbon, sustainability. How can we bring that into an area that leakage is actually targeted, but not solely as an individual performance commitment?
Definitely. Well, with all the scenarios, we've gone through a SWOT analysis of the different things that could be done for and the different ways in which it looks that, again, if you're doing mains renewals, don't just do mains renewals, look at how would you design that network if you had the chance over again. If you're doing pressure management, how do you make it adaptive so that it's giving the right pressure to customers so that they're not seeing DG2 style issues or poor pressures. It's how do you sort of relate the lead sort of water quality supply pipe. Okay, if you're replacing that, how do you make it in a way that you make it leak-free when you're doing that replacement? And so it's, none of it's revolutionary. We're not saying that at all. I think it's very much evolutionary of how we're thinking about these things, and again, the holistic sort of nature of what we're looking at. And one, I think the things that sort of talking to the regulators, that they're like, well, okay, well, how do we then split the funds out for, if you're looking at it holistically, how do you say, well, this bit's for leakage, or this bit's for pressure, and this bit's for interruptions to supply, when actually the best solution is, it's a little bit of everything, and it's not arbitrary how much of each of these solutions goes to this pocket or this sort of pocket of money, but it's trying to sort of take the regulator on that sort of thought process that the holistic approach is probably the best approach. But at the same time, it's very difficult for us to then say, okay, well, this commitment's going to have this much money against it, and this commitment's going to have this much money. It's more, this basket of commitments is going to have this much money. And that also gives you that sort of flexibility to do these adaptive changes as and when you need to, because of the sort of the outcomes on each of those PCC targets.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons that decision framework is so key in terms of that list of things to do, is making sure that there's wider consideration, carbon, net zero, that it's all factored in. Because the WRMP factors in, you know, tends to be focused on savings in terms of volume rather than some of the wider aspects. It doesn't tend to touch so much on network water quality and other things like that. So I think it's key that happens quite soon.
So how can we, I mean, we talked about earlier on, we talked about metering, yeah, in particular smart metering. And it's really a question probably for Dean, but also maybe either David or Paul. We keep saying smart metering, and metering in itself is a really good enabler to making a step change. So, and it's obviously part of the WRMP, mainly about metering in itself, bringing that percentage of metered customers down. But how can we actually make the case, and this is a question from the floor as well, how can we make the case for compulsory metering? Yeah, not just in water-stressed areas. How can we have those multiple benefits very much spelled out, that if you don't start sooner and you don't introduce that smart element, I'm not talking about AMR, talking about AMI and beyond that, as part of an enabler to meet our ultimate leakage levels. And Dean, I know that you're doing a lot of work with Artesia on making the case, and there's been a lot of work in the recent years as part of Pier 19.
So, yeah.
How can we make that change?
It's really interesting because if you look in the long term, there clearly are benefits, and it's across multiple parts of the business. And I think it's down to, there's two important things. One is ambition. What is your ambition if you're going to put in smart metering? It's not, it's not just about having a cheaper bill. It's about recognising what benefits you can get out of it and how you work towards that, because then maturity comes into that piece as well. So, and if you look, it's really interesting, I think, if you look back at where the companies that are now rolling out some real smart AMI fixed network solutions, where they've had their challenges, because it's a big thing to go and put a meter in every single house. That's a lot of work and just logistics. But then you've got to put the back office system around it, which allows you to take that massive increased amount of data. Historically, you've had 1 or 2 bits of information about that property every year, and you send out 1 or 2 bits of paper every year back to that property. Now you're getting 24, 96 bits of information every day from every single meter, every day of the year, for now until whenever, and that's a huge increase. So you've got to have the infrastructure to be able to deal with that. And then you need to have the solutions that come from that to be developed. And we're in a process of evolution at the moment. We're starting to play with that data. Enormous amounts of insight you can get from that data, but the tools for getting that are being developed as we speak, and they will continue to be developed over the next 5 years, along with the technology. And so there is a maturity journey that the industry, I think, is going on. And when you bring all that together, then you start to realise, I think, some real big benefits. And metering, this word compulsory metering in itself has changed over the last few years from, well, metering is putting a meter in a property and then moving the customer onto a metered bill. Now it's gone, well, let's put a meter in that property. We can give the customer choice whether they go onto a metered bill, or we can just use that information to make our operations more efficient. So and this comes back to collaboration and sharing, and we're starting to see Thames and Anglian talk about the benefits they're realising from these programmes. There was a recent report from Thames Water came out earlier this year on how they're using that to help their vulnerable customers. It's well worth a read, because it really does answer some very specific questions. And we can expect more information, I think, to come out and be shared with the sector. And that helps people make those cases and make those decisions. It's a very individual thing. We've got companies who have got 80% dumb meters in the ground. We've got companies who've got 40% dumb meters in the ground. It's a real specific thing. And it's not just about bills, it's not just about per capita consumption, it is about leakage. It can influence supply interruptions and how you manage those. It can influence CMEX and how you manage that. It can influence the future BMEX and RMEX in terms of the non-household sector as well. So ambition, maturity. The last bit is technology. There is much more technology around now than there was 5 years ago in this area. And we see a whole range of fixed network solutions emerging from the sector. And I'm not going to run through them, but there are many more solutions that are being implemented and being trialled now. And so that gives us a richer pot to choose from. It also introduces competition, which drives innovation. So I think it's, the case is difficult to make, but when you look at some of the results companies are getting at the moment, it has to be one of those things that's looked at seriously.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, I would like to thank you very much for all your contributions, both in presentations and obviously answering a lot of questions. I'd like to thank the audience for the questions that they've posed. Just a reminder, as Joe said, the report is there. It's available on the Water UK website. It's for free. Now, there's a lot of research and time and effort gone into it. And the reason why it's for free is that we want everybody to read it. We don't want it to become another Acquia report that just sits on the shelf. It's there to be used. It's there to be challenged, adapted, and taken forward. We've got a real challenge on our plate here. We know that. And that's not just at 2050, 2030 levels. I mean, we've got a poll going at the moment in the background, and that shows that the majority of people actually questions the achievability of our 2025 targets. So we need to change that, and we need to change that view rapidly, because otherwise we won't be able to give that sustainable future that we need with major leakage reduction activities. So I'd like to thank our contributors. So thank you very much for all of you. And I hand back to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Frank, and Jeremy, David, Dean, Glenn, Joe and Paul. Fantastic, really very fantastic. I mean, it just struck me actually, when you look at the route map, this is really helping to lead the debate with regulators in the same way that the long-term water resource management planning framework did. And the reason we do regional water planning is because of work we did as a sector to actually say this is how we should plan and work. Similar example with the route to net zero and that route map. This is playing the same sort of role, and it's bringing out lots of the key issues, isn't it? It's bringing out the debates on incentives. Where are the perverse incentives? That interruptions to supply versus reline, supply chain resourcing, the costs issue moving forwards, the criticality of understanding background leakage. All these things are being surfaced, and it's showing leadership, because what we're doing is we're drawing in all the other players. We're talking to our supply chain, but also bringing in regulators, and we're having a discussion. We're leading the agenda as opposed to waiting for somebody to tell us what a target should be, which is fantastic. The adaptive pathways, really, really compelling, a different way of working. But actually, if we didn't have this route map built in this way, there'd be a real mismatch with the water resource management plans, which are built in an adaptive way, but also the long-term delivery strategies, which Ofwat has required all water companies to build their next plans based on. They're all built in that way. So we've now got a route map which is thinking about it in the right way, which we can all work from as companies. I don't quite know where we'd have been if we didn't have that. So again, really fantastic. I think leakage is a cool place to be, but there is an opportunity to link that through to the environment agenda more clearly, I think. And the diversity point, I mean, it is important. We need to get more diversity in this space. It will lead to more innovation. It will drive greater creativity. And it is an opportunity for us, I think. But maybe linking through to the environment agenda more clearly, and maybe linking through to the digital agenda, as was suggested, are great ways to do that. So that's something for us to think about, I think. And the UK is becoming that global place to go for leakage, and that's happened in a matter of a few years. Isn't that a fantastic thing? That's a fantastic opportunity for UK PLC. So that's a really positive thing to pick up. But we do need, I think Jez mentioned, we still need to continue stepping up innovation and collaboration, and that's very much what the next session is going to be looking at. So we're now going to take a 30-minute break for networking, refreshments and discussions with some of the exhibitors out there. So we're going to restart at 11:45 promptly. So 11:45, all back in here, please. Let's see if we can do a slightly better job than we did starting right at the beginning. So 11:45. Thanks all very much. Thank you. Well done.